COVID-19 has left economies around the world reeling from the fallout of the pandemic. And the Philippines is no exception.
Kami pa rin gagawa ng kapalaran namin dito sa mundo. Hindi na kami umaasa sa gobyerno.
The pandemic has forced schools to shut down their doors and keep students at home.
Magiging pabigat na lang ako sa pamilya ko. Ganun.
Last year alone, around 2 million students dropped out of school. Many have taken up illegal and often dangerous jobs to help families cope with the economic impact of the health crisis.
Trabaho, padyak lang po para makapag-ano po, manap buhay yan. Iniisip pa po nun. Padyak lang ng padyak para mabuhay.
How can these children be helped? What would it take for the Philippine government to save these children before it's too late?
Ngayong pandemya, ang hirap po. Kahit madaling araw ka na umalis o kaya madilim pa. Pagdating mo rin, halos wala rin pong tao dahil wala naman pong ipamimili yung mga tao ngayon, kaya wala rin pong pasahero.
Life has come to a virtual standstill in the Philippines. That's after the government placed a major part of the city under strict lockdown. The once busy street in Manila is now empty. The tight COVID-19 restrictions have snuffed out faint signs of recovery that the people are hoping for, especially for 47-year-old Jonathan Mapa, a bicycle taxi driver.
Nakakain naman po. Bali yung nagkipagkulitan na lang po ako sa harap buhay sa labas kahit minsan alam mahigpit, bawal, gano'n. Eh wala naman pong kaysa naman po mamatay kami sa gutom. Nagkipagsapalaran na lang po talaga ako sa labas.
Even more worrying for his family is the fate of his 12-year-old son, also named Jonathan. His entire future is now at stake in the midst of the continuing lockdown.
Nag-aalala po ako sa kinabukasan ko dahil sa pag-aaral.
For 1.5 years, the Philippines has been under varying degrees of lockdown, with certain industries remaining closed while others have been partially operating at 50% at the most. Stringent restrictions have pulled the GDP down to its lowest in 7 decades. Now, more than 4 million people have lost their jobs. Their livelihoods have also been left in tatters. At least 2 million youths are out of school.
The youth is affected by the COVID pandemic and no one seems to talk about it. We have heard how specific sectors or demographic groups were at a disadvantage, right? We've heard, for example, how frontliners are at a disadvantage. Well, it's true because they're the ones at the forefront of the pandemic. And we've also heard about OFWs and OFW families. We've heard about how the family members of OFWs who have lost their jobs abroad are in a much more difficult position because now they have less remittances and they have a limited savings to depend on. But one specific demographic age group that I think was left behind in these discussions was the youth.
A sluggish economy, along with slow vaccination rates, have made the country the worst place to be during the pandemic, according to research assessing how 53 nations have been managing disruptions caused by COVID-19.
Part of the problem is that we never get a clear understanding of what the reason for one degree of lockdown over another is. There seems to be no consistent recording and transmission of information so that we understand what is going on and how we should cope with the problem. The prescription is you follow the rules. However, sometimes incomprehensible the rules are. And then they say, oh, this doesn't work pala. It just turns out this doesn't work. Never mind, you can forget about them.
Quarantine exacts a heavy toll, especially for daily wage earners like Jonathan. His slum community has been put under total lockdown thrice in the past year and a half for a total of 4 months. No mobility, no passengers, and no income.
Nung wala pa pong pandemic, medyo nakaraos po kami ng medyo konti. Hindi naman po talaga sobra-sobra. Nakakaano ko ng mga bayarin. Natutustusan ko po yung pag-aaral ng anak kong bunso. Nabibilang ko po ng gatas yung apo ko. Tapos yung mga ibang gastusin po rito, medyo na aanohan ko rin po na pupunan. Tulad yan, pag marating na yung mga bayarin, di ko alam kung saan ko kukunin yung pambabayad sa mga katulad niya na bayarin. Tapos siyempre, kano lang po yung kinikita. Siyempre, unahin ko po muna yung pagkain ng pamilya ko. Minsan talagang makikiusap na lang sa may-ari ng kaya tulad niya, mga ilaw, kaya tubig.
Tuwing po nagkaka-lockdown, nalulungkot din po si Papa, nalulungkot din po kami lahat. Kasi po wala nang trabaho si Papa, no.
To compensate for the losses during total lockdowns, the government handed out on average $78 a month to families like Jonathan's. But it is barely half of what he usually makes.
Aasa ka na lang po sa ayuda. Meron man po. Talagang dumarating po sa buhay talaga na minsan may bigas, kaya lang yung pang ulam, talagang kaya minsan may ulam, wala naman bigas. Minsan nga, yung almusal ng mga anak ko, hati-hati na lang sila sa sa konting tinapay, kaya kape, ganyan. Kung meron man.
Tuwing nagkaka-lockdown po, ang kinakain lang po namin, tubig, tsaka asin, tsaka kanin po. Kasi wala na po akong pambiling pagkain nun eh. Yun na lang po yung ginawa namin.
12-year-old Jonathan is the youngest of 9 children and a beacon of hope for the family.
Ang pangarap ko po sa anak ko, kay Jonathan, kung palarin, ay mababang lang, kahit yung pinakamaano lang na kurso, kahit yung teacher, ganyan. Kaya may sabi na natapos para kahit yung malang ang may pamana sa kanya po.
Mahal na mahal ako ng tatay ko. Lagi niya po akong inaatid eh. Araw-araw. Sa eskwelahan ko po. Tapos binibigyan niya po ako ng baon. Na 10 ganun. Sa eskwelahan. The best po si tatay po. Gusto ko pong makapagtapos ng pag-aaral para po sa kanya. Tsaka sa mga kapatid ko po.
Talagang inaano ko po siya na mag-aral po ng mabuti. Kahit mahirap, talagang sinusurvive po namin mag-asawa yung pag-aaral niya para hindi po mga tulad siya sa mga ibang bata na nasa lansangan, nagtatrabaho.
But the health crisis has forced children to bear the brunt of the raging pandemic. In Jonathan's village, almost every other child as young as 10 end up scavenging, unintendedly flouting the law on child labor to help put food on the table. Eventually, these children end up with worse lifelong problems.
Mga batang ganyan, napaaga sa pagtatrabaho. Nandyan na rin yung hindi ko naman po nila lahat. Siyempre, hindi napapariwara yung buhay. Natututong magbisyo. Kasi walang magulang na tumututok. Saka iniisip nila marunong na silang magtrabaho. Na ano nila yung gusto nilang bilhin kahit bawal.
Dad Jonathan is struggling to keep his son safe when the government ordered all schools to close.
Philippine President Rodrigo Duterte says he won't allow students to go back to school until a coronavirus vaccine is available. He says if no one graduates, then so be it.
Only 20% of the Filipino population have been vaccinated to date. The low vaccination rate has heightened the risk of exposure to the virus, making them vulnerable to infections. Campus closure has been extended for the second school year in an effort to contain the spread of the virus. The Philippines is one of the two nations and the only Asian country to have not resumed face-to-face classes.
According to the UNESCO data on school closures, in the whole of Southeast Asia and East Asia, the Philippines has the longest duration of school closures, which means schools have not been opened since mid-March 2020. That is alarming because our neighboring countries, Indonesia, Malaysia, Thailand, Vietnam, to some extent, have partially opened schools. And what's troubling about this is that the Philippines is an island economy, right? We're composed of many different regions and provinces, and not all regions and provinces are affected the same way, which means that a blanket policy, which is school closures for all, is definitely not the right approach to go for.
The country's economic managers estimate that 1 year of school closure already costs the economy about $4.5 million, losses that would most likely be felt by the Filipino youth for the next 40 years. With a study-at-home policy, most schools in Manila shifted to online learning. The problem is, access to the internet as well as gadgets is widely uneven. Based on the government's rapid assessment, 6.3 million households do not have access to the internet, while 2 million households have no devices for learning. Even before the pandemic, Dad Jonathan could ill afford a smartphone.
Nanghiram lang po ako ng cellphone sa ate ko. Yung ate ko po, kailangan din pong umalis para pumunta sa kabila. Ayun po, natigil po yung pag-aaral ko.
Sinubukan mo bang humingi ng cellphone kay Papa?
Oo. Kaso ano daw na di daw kaya Hindi daw kaya.
Masakit ba para sa iyo yun?
Po.
Bakit masakit para sa iyo?
Naigit po kaya ako ng mga bata Silang may cellphone ako wala
Determined to continue his studies, 12-year-old Jonathan made a painful decision on his own. But how far will he go to achieve his dream? The Philippines is the worst place to be in a pandemic, according to experts. And its youth are paying the price for the government's weak response to COVID-19. Enrollment numbers are down by 2% compared to pre-pandemic figures. That's more than 2 million students. and 12-year-old Jonathan Mapa is one of them. Initially, he used his eldest sister's phone for online lessons.
Nawala po yung ate ko. Sabi ko, di na yata akong makakapag-aaral lang. Sabi ko, ayan. Sabi ko, hindi na ako nakapag-aaral kasi wala na akong wala nang cellphone. Kailangan ko muna maghanap ng pambiling cellphone.
Naawa ko sa kanya, kaya lang wala naman kami magawa. Sabi ko nga, gusto ko siya utangan ng cellphone. Yung hulugan, kaya lang, tapos naman eh. Sabi ko, paano nga nag-aaral ka? Kasi nung time na yung ma'am, nagbigayan ng mga tablet, hindi siya nabigyan dahil ubos na daw. Nalista pa nga ang pangalan niya. Nagpila-pila pa nga yung papa niya. Haros nakikipagsiksikan sa pilan sa Amado. Pagdating dun, wala na daw.
Nowadays, Jonathan's father earns only $3, or half of his pre-pandemic income. Desperate, 12-year-old Jonathan resorted to scavenging for recyclables. It is his father's greatest fear.
Nalalaman ko po sa mama niya po na kasi pag uwi ko, tinatanong ko, asan si Jonathan, yung gusto ko nga. Sabi naman ng mama niya, nanguha. Minsan po hindi po kasi nagpapaalam niya kasi alam niya po, hindi namin siya papayagan. Minsan nalalaman na lang po namin niya sa mga barkada niya, sa mga kapwa-bata niya na sumama pala sa mga nanguha, ganun po. Yun, nalalaman na lang po namin pag wala na siya, doon na siya nakaalis na.
Sabi ko, mama, ilan pa ba ako mag-aaral? Sabi ko po. Sabi ko, mama, mag-ipon na ako. Ayaw ng pera. Nag-ipon po kami kaso nag-gastos po ulit.
Jonathan's 47-year-old mother, Nomilita, suffers from arthritis that requires taking daily medication to manage her pain.
Opo, bigla na lang po siya nagkasakit. Biglaan po eh. Bigla nagulat na lang po ako, nagkakasakit na siya. Yung nagkasakit po si mama, binenta po namin yung aming loop sa bahay para lang po mapagamot si mama. Nakaipon ako ng mga 1.5. Pinanggamot ko niya na sa ospital.
Jonathan is now trapped in a vicious cycle. As long as his family faces hunger and schools are closed. He also joins an estimated 160 million children worldwide who have been pushed into hazardous work because of the pandemic.
Tuwing nagpapadyak po ako, nagugutom po ako kasi po wala akong dalang pagkain. Ayun po. Kasi po, natatakot din po ako. Kasi kumukulo na po yung tiyan ko nun. Tsaka nahirapan din po sa preno. Baka makasagasa. Niingat ako. Minsan po hindi rin. Natakot po ako sa mga truck. Ginigilid ko po.
Halo-halo ma'am ang ko nun eh. Kasi siyempre kinakabahan bilang magulang, bilang ama. Kasi napakabata niya pa, may madisgrasya siya dyan. At saka inaano ko po, baka may mahuli siya ng dito, mga taga City Hall. Tapos siyempre kami ang mapapagalitan. Kasi kung baka sabihin, pinabayaan namin yung bata na manguha.
Trabaho, padyak lang po para manap buhay. Niisip pa po lang. Padyak lang ng padyak para mabuhay.
On average, 12-year-old Jonathan earns as much as his father.
Binibigay ko lahat kay mama. Pinababayad niya na sa pinangbibili niya na pa po ng pagkain na bigas, tsaka kalabasa na gulay. Eh po kasi yung paborito ko eh.
Hindi ko na lang po pinapakita sa kanila, pero sinasarili ko na lang po. Yung sabi na gusto ko mang umiyak, kaya lang hindi naman pwedeng ipakita mo sa asawa o mga anak mo kasi mas lalo silang mapanghinaan ng loob.
The number of children pushed into child labor by the pandemic has yet to be tracked by the Philippine government.
I don't want to sound overly pessimistic, but I think we have to recognize that we are really facing a crisis that is not only a learning crisis, it's a generational crisis that will affect all segments of the society.
Sobrang dami po nangangalakal sa aming mga bata, kaya gumaya rin ako. Marami rin po eh. Maraming batang nangangalangan ngayon dahil sa hirap ng buhay. Ano po.
Wala po kaming naririnig sa gobyerno kung ano yung plano sa amin. Kung paano makaahon kami sa kahirapan na to. Kung ano, wala, hindi namin alam kung anong plano na talaga ng gobyerno sa amin. Siguro kami pa rin ang gagawa ng kapalaran namin dito sa mundo. Hindi na kami umaasa sa gobyerno.
It has been 9 months since 12-year-old Jonathan began scavenging. Each moment spent working is a step further away from his dreams.
Sa ngayon, gusto ko pong bumalik sa pag-aaral. Kaso hindi ko po alam.
So ano na ngayon ang mangyayari sa pag-aaral mo?
Ewan ko po. Ewan ko po.
Unlike Jonathan, 3 of the Damia children are carrying on with their studies, but they are struggling to cope with distance learning.
Minsan masakit din po pag tinitignan mo yung grades mo, tapos magulang mo, nakikita mo sila naghihirap.
Life is a constant struggle for 56-year-old odd job laborer dad, Donicio. Armed with just a basic education, he could only find work in contractual, blue-collar jobs. When jobs are not readily available, he'd go into the forest in search of forest products to sell for some cash.
Si Papa naghahakot lang po ng uling, ganun po. Tapos nagputo ng mga puno para lang makakain kami, ganun po. Mahirap din po sa kalooban ng anak ng iba po. Pag ganun. Pag nakikita yung magulang mo, ganun po.
"14-year-old Judith is the brightest among a family of 5. She aspires to be a police officer so that she could earn a decent income to help ease the family's financial burden.
Sabi niya po, pag magtapos daw po ako at para maangat ko pa yung pamilya ko doon po sa paghihirap namin.
Sabi ko nga sa kanila, ayaw kong makikita kayo, kagaya ko.
The Damia family lives in a village that has very poor or no internet connections. So, like 80% of Filipino families, they opted for what the government calls modular distance learning. Under this scheme, teachers hand out and collect paper-based modules at least once a week. These modules lay out detailed instructions for studying and weekly assessments. It is designed for learning on one's own without a teacher's help. Key subjects like English, math, and science are written in English, which makes self-learning almost impossible for students like Judith.
Medyo malalim po yung salita, ganun po. English din po na hindi maintindihan. Minsan, umiikot na po yung yung mga tinatanong. Ulitin ko ulit bago pumasok sa utak ko yung sagot. Yung module po, hindi po mapapaliwanag ng teacher kasi wala po sila dito. Hindi rin po mapapaliwanag ng magulang kasi hindi din po sila nakapag-aral na maayos. Yan lang po.
Iba. Masakit na sa akin talaga na hindi ko maturuan siya ng maayos kasi ang naabot ko hanggang doon na ako. Hindi ko alam.
The Damia family is not an isolated case. A survey of 1,000 families conducted by the Movement for Safe, Equitable and Relevant Education reveals a pattern. 1 in every 5 students had no one to guide them in their studies. 1 in 10 students claim to fall behind in school. 12% of the parents indicate that at least one of their children has stopped schooling.
Repeated problems already, they couldn't answer the modules. What's their learning? I would say that we have poor quality of education because of how we teach our students.
Alone in her struggles, Judith's final marks sank from a pre-pandemic average of 85 down to a slightly passing grade of 79.
Minsan po, nangangamba ako, ba't ang baba ng grade ko po, ganun po. Nasasabi ko sa sarili ko, ba't ang baba ng grade ko? Malungkot din po, pinarsige ko yun, tapos ganun lang po yung grade ko.
Printed modules were certainly the most practicable way of delivering and continuing the delivery of education, but it probably was not the optimal when it comes to ensuring that actually children are learning as they are going to school.
How long will this learning crisis continue? Will the economic downturn and continuing school closures force these children out of school forever? Life has taken a sudden and unexpected turn for 19-year-old undergraduate Juriel Natividad. It happened after his mom Alma, who worked as a massage therapist in the United Arab Emirates, lost her job in 2020 following the outbreak. And that has caused a deep economic hardship and financial distress to the family.
Dati po, nakapag-aral pa po ako sa private school nung elementary po ako dahil maganda pa po yung buhay noon, hindi pa masyadong hirap. Siyempre, yung nanay ko po is OFW. Nasa ibang bansa po siya nagpapakahirap. Tinitiis niya po yung hirap ng buhay doon para lang makapag-aral ako. Kada buwan po, pinapadala niya halos lahat po ng sweldo niya. Konti na lang din po yung natitira para siyempre, sa mga pangangailangan niya po. Kahit po naging OFW si Mama, kailangan ko pa rin po mag-aral ng mabuti kasi hindi naman po kasi siya habang buhay nandun eh. At saka po, gusto ko po siyang matulungan na ako naman po dahil dun po sa ilang taon niya po sa ibang bansa na pagpapakahirap, pagpapakapagod, pagsasakripisyo niya para mapag-aral ako. Gusto ko po ako naman po yung bumawi sa kanya.
Juriel would have been in the second year of his university education had his mum not lost her job abroad. Nowadays, they can hardly afford high-speed internet to help him in his studies. So, he dropped out of school.
Sa tingin ko, labis po siya nasaktan. Kasi po, kahit po hindi po siya nagalit sa akin, alam ko po deep inside na, ayun po, hindi biro yung mga pagsasakripisyo niya. Kasi ako po, kahit hindi ba po ako parent, naisip ko po na kung ako yung nasa lugar ni Mama na ilang taong nagsakripisyo, binuhos niya yung effort niya, tapos mawawala lang ng isang saglit. Ay, syempre, madidisappoint po ako. Ayun. Masyado pong masakit sa damdamin. Hindi naman po agad-agad na matatanggap ko na, uy, di na ako mag-aaral. Tambay na lang ako dito sa bahay. Magiging pabigat na lang ako sa pamilya ko. Ganun. Nakakaramdam po ako ng inggit since ako magsa-second year pa lang, sila magsa-third year na. Siyempre, hindi ko naman sila masisisi kung maganda yung internet connection nila, maganda yung stable yung finances nila. Hindi ko naman sila masisisi. Pero deep down, naiinggit talaga ako sa kanila and nakakaramdam ako ng konting disappointment.
So long as Juriel is out of school and idle, he'd remain a burden to the economy. He doesn't have the qualification nor the necessary training to be a productive member of society.
The youth should be in either one of them, right? To be a productive member of society, they should soak up all the human capital they can at this point. So in the future, they get better labor market opportunities. But they also drop out of school, which means these are idle years, right? So idle years in the sense that it's not contributing to human capital development for future benefits, so to speak. Yeah.
Jurel spends time tending to the family's small store. The income can only cover their daily needs. That's why Jurel is desperately seeking a job, even though the odds are heavily stacked against him. He's competing with nearly 4 million other Filipinos currently unemployed as a result of the pandemic.
Napakahirap po kasi sa panahon ngayon na ang daming open na position and mga may experience lang yung may advantage pagdating sa application process.
What we can infer from this is that other parts of the labor force seem to be recovering already, right? The recovery process is already happening, but the youth is not recovering as quickly.
The Philippines is suffering from its worst economic recession in decades. The country's economic managers say it will take more than 10 years to return to pre-pandemic growth. So, whether Jurel goes back to school or lands a job in these coming years remains uncertain for now.
But what we know from past evidence of past recessions is that there are scarring effects. They literally used the term scarring, which means that individuals or the youth who enter the labor market during a recession, they suffer permanent income losses at least for a decade, right? And it only dissipates, right? They only earn as much as their counterparts who entered the labor market during normal times, only after a decade.
Jurel, however, lays the blame squarely on the government. He feels that the government is not doing enough to help young people like him to get out of their predicament.
Opinion ko po, hindi po kaming mga kabataang Pilipino ang focus ngayon ng gobyerno. Dahil na po sa pandemic, dahil po sa budget issues, kaya po doon, sa tingin ko po, kulang po yung nalalaan na tulong po sa amin ng gobyerno. Ang panawagan ko po sa gobyerno na bigyan nila sana ng aksyon is yung pag-aaral ng kabataan. Ang mga nararamdaman ng kabataan dahil sa generation ngayon, lalo na ngayong pandemic, mataas ang cases ng instability ng utak ng kabataan. Kagaya ko, hindi ko maiiwasan noon na malungkot, ma-depress, pagiging anxious sa hinaharap ko. Nais ko na itutukan yun ng gobyerno. Pati na rin yung paghahanap ng kabuhayan para sa kabataang Pilipino.
There's also a mental health crisis unfolding among children, according to Save the Children, a child rights advocate.
So mental health effects include mental and emotional stress, anxiety, depression, and panic attacks. The students shared that these mental concerns were triggered by being overwhelmed with the class and household duties, limited or lack of social interaction, inability to understand the lessons through distance learning, or they had difficulty in self-directed learning.
Ayun nga po, parang bukod po sa, nawalan ako ng gana. Parang nawalan ako ng gana sa pag-aaral. Nawalan din ako ng gana kumain. Parang kahit nagugutom ako, parang hindi ko makakain. Hindi ko, parang kahit gutom ako, ayoko na tumayo, ganun.
18-year-old Micah's ordeal began with a simple misunderstanding between her classmates, when she accidentally deleted her classmates' compiled essays on a shared document.
Mga gabi na po na yun, sabi nila, minention po ako sa GC. Parang ganun, sabi niya, Hazel, sabi ko, bakit? Nakita ko na, sabi na, grabe ka na, pati isang PT lang tinira mo, ganyan, tapos kinopya mo, ganyan, tapos minura po ako nung ganun. Ganun, tapos kung ano po yung mga sinabi, umiyak ako. Nasaktan po ako dun sa kasi hindi naman po talaga ako nangopya. Kasabi ko nga po sa kanila, kahit tingnan din po nila yung gawa ko, hindi ko po talaga sila kinopyahan. Kahit isa po, wala pong parehas sa kanila.
Hostile arguments online involving insults is called flaming, a form of cyberbullying. Even before the pandemic, UNICEF estimates that cyber violence affects almost half of Filipino children ages 13 to 17. 1/3 of these cases involve verbal abuse over cell phones.
Cyberbullying is so much insidious, so much more insidious than traditional bullying. Because bullying is the physical bullying in school or what, it happens during this time and only these people saw it. Yeah, but cyberbullying, you don't know where it goes.
For 3 months now, eating and sleeping have become harder for Micah. The constant harassment has also affected her studies.
Bumaba po lahat ng grades ko.
Bakit masakit sa'yo na bumaba ang grades mo?
Kasi po, may goal po. Kumbaga ayoko pong bumababa yung grades ko. Kasi baka hindi po ako makapasok sa mga college. Kasi kailangan, sabi po nila, lalo na po sa mga public, ganun po. May pinakamatataas po yung priority.
You don't want a major part of the young generation having mental problems, because unless you have a very robust system of dealing with them, that condition is going to persist through their life, and people are living longer.
The Filipino youths are suffering in silence. Distance learning has only done more harm than good. Returning to face-to-face schools would help mitigate the negative impact of a physical separation between teachers and students. A pilot program that would shift its students back to the classroom has been approved by the President only a month ago, but it will only take effect next month. For now, Filipino youths are forced to endure their struggles with long-lasting consequences.
We cannot continue keeping our schools closed.
Since the pandemic began early last year, youth unemployment in the country has swelled to 31.6%. That's about 1 in 6 young people currently unemployed. And 19-year-old Juriel Natividad is one of them. He can't find a proper job to help ease the family's financial burden. He also can't go back to school because the family is just too poor to support his university education. One way to help people like him is to encourage companies to hire young workers.
One way that we could look into is, for example, something like employer subsidies, right? There in other countries in Europe that have persistently high levels of youth unemployment, right? For example, Spain or Italy, they have experimented with programs such as employer subsidies for those hiring youth workers. I don't think we have that sort of program right now, but that's something that we should definitely look into.
But that can only be done once the economy, which has been severely battered by the pandemic, is back on track. Before the onset of the COVID-19 outbreak, the Philippines was poised to become the next Asian tiger economy. It posted an average growth of more than 6% annually for 9 years. But now, its economy is faltering. And it would take years to recover to pre-pandemic growth levels. That has put limits on the government's capacity to deal with the crisis of this magnitude while the children suffer.
The issue really is our capacity to deal with the problem. You know, people are saying that at this stage, it no longer makes sense to make a difference between natural and political calamities. They're the same now. The damage of natural calamities depends on the capacity of the people in authority to deal with them. Unless the kids are educated, there is no hope for them to improve their standing in life.
There have been growing calls from many quarters, including the UN's Children Fund, for schools to be reopened and in-person learning to be resumed. The concern is prolonged closure would further exacerbate the education crisis in the country, leading to more school dropouts and youth unemployment.
Kailangan sana magbukas na nga para magnormal na yung klase ng mga bata. Kasi para doon talaga ang teacher pag nagturo kasi, kakaiba talaga na mag-module ka kaysa piece-to-piece talaga. Kasi maturuan ng teacher at nandun yung kanilang focus.
47-year-old Dionisio Damia's biggest worry is his 10-year-old Jane.
Wala kasi ang luma dito magagawa. Kaaral na lang ako.
Jane had to drop out of school in her first grade when she had only begun to read and write. Elder sister Judith is barely coping with distance learning and has little time to spare to tutor her sister, while Dad, Dionisio, and Mom Rowena are undereducated themselves and are incapable of guiding their child.
Nag-module sila.
Nag-ano?
Nag-module.
Nag-module. Pero ikaw wala kang module.
Wala.
Anong pakiramdam nun?
Masakit lang.
Nowadays, Jane is helping her mom at a small store while taking care of the family's newborn at the same time. She has already missed 2 years of learning. Young dropouts like her are highly likely to stay out of school for the rest of their lives, and Jane would become a permanent liability to her family and the country if it stays that way.
We have a young population. They will be taking their place in the labor force. They will be able to be productive. Therefore, they will be able to support the aging population. But that is true only if that younger generation is prepared to address the tasks of the employment market. And without education, that ability is going to be severely limited. The dropout is a significant issue. I'm not belittling the importance of that problem, but you've got to take it in the context of your responsibility for the larger population that are also at risk. Because if you don't do a good job with the 26 million, they're going to be dropouts. And you have that segment of the population, becoming an even bigger drag on the society.
Saving the children's future requires investment and innovation. The city of Navotas has one of the lowest dropout rates and highest re-enrollment rates in the country. It invested $2.3 million this school year so that learners like 8-year-old Brian would be supplied with what he needs, like mobile phones, prepaid credits, and school supplies. Volunteers are also being mobilized to help tutor students like him at least once a week.
Grade ko nun po 50 po. Tapos 75. Masaya po. Kakaano na po ako. Kaka-module.
We're going to have to go in what has been for the country the default position. We're going to have to rely again on the private sector. We're going to have to rely on NGOs, on the the civil society organizations to supplement the ability of government to address these basic tasks. And even in the handling of the pandemic, it's really the private sector that has taken a very strong lead in addressing the issues.
Back in Manila City, an afternoon spent scavenging has only earned 12-year-old Jonathan 40 cents. It's barely enough to buy a kilogram of rice.
Gusto ko makatulong sa Gusto ko talaga makatulong So talaga tumulong kay mama kasi talaga yung buhay. Gusto ko talaga mga lakal para makano ko siya.
In this slum community, income as well as help have dwindled. COVID restrictions have prevented outsiders from coming in to provide aid to poor people like him.
Nung hindi pandemic, mama, napaka-luwag po dito. Malaking tulong po nabibigay, kompleto yung mga batang nabibigyan ng sapatos, pagkain, lahat ng vitamins, lahat po ng mga bata na kasama doon sa mga NGO na yun, nabibigay po nila. Pero sa ngayon po, halos ibinibigyan na lang po nila, mga 1/4 o 1/2 na lang po ang nabibigyan nilang tulong. Although na isang bagay na rin po yung bawal na rin po lumabas, bawal din po yung mga tulad po na taga-ibang bansa, mostly kasi nabibigyan ng tulong dito sa mga NGO, taga-ibang bansa.
Sana po makapagtapos ako ng pag-aaral. Tapos po yung COVID na yan po, sana matanggal na po. Ganun lang po yung tingin ko.
Mag-aaral. Tapos magbabasa. Magbabasa ng IEO.
COVID-19 ravaged the gains the Philippines had made in a decade, and the government's weak response is failing its youth, leaving a generation and a country unable to find its way.
Ramdaman ko po ay malungkot. May nararamdamang pagod. Ayun po. Tapos may awa rin. Nag-aalala rin po ako sa kinabukasan ko. Ayun po.